The Karbala Tragedy, Rethinking Responsibility Through Political Theory. The Karbala Tragedy. Introduction. In an age where access to a multitude of opinions and arguments has become easier than ever, it is vital that we do not merely consume ideas passively, but seek to understand the reasoning behind them. The ability to discern the logic of an argument, rather than reacting solely on the basis of emotion, popularity, or cultural sentiment, is essential for preserving the intellectual strength and integrity of any society. If we lose this ability, we risk replacing informed judgment with reactive rhetoric and critical thinking with crowd consensus. It is through the rigorous examination of ideas and claims, even those that are emotionally charged or widely accepted, that a society retains its moral and intellectual authority. The tragedy of Karbala, this historical event, is often remembered with intense emotion and reverence, yet it also invites critical questions about power, responsibility, and justice, questions that merit reasoned analysis as much as heartfelt remembrance.
The issue. A fundamental challenge in our intellectual and religious discourse today, in this age of information technology, is that regardless of what one argues, there will almost always be someone who disagrees. Within the Muslim world, this often manifests as a recurring pattern of debate. One group asserts a particular position while another presents a contradictory view, each invoking a different authority or interpretation. This dynamic has, over time, fostered a tendency to question even the most sacred aspects of our tradition, not out of a desire for understanding, but as a reflexive response to disagreement. With each successive generation, we have become increasingly accustomed to asking, where does it say this in the Quran? And when matters pertain to events or principles that emerged after the revelation of the Quran, the instinctive question becomes, who said this? Followed swiftly by, well, I know someone who said the opposite. Such a culture of competing opinions without a commitment to reasoned evaluation risks reducing our religious engagement to a mere tally of who said what. This approach undermines our ability to think independently, to apply logic, and to assess arguments on their intellectual merit. It encourages an unscientific mode of thought, in which emotions and allegiances are given priority over critical reasoning. If this becomes the norm, we risk stifling our collective intellectual development and diminishing the moral clarity that ought to define our religious discourse.
The problem. One of the most emotionally charged subjects in Islamic history, where discussions frequently descend into disputes over who said what is the tragedy of Karbala. It is indeed troubling that even today there remains disagreement over the most basic facts of what occurred on that day, and over the individuals responsible for the decisions that led to its horrors. Among the most debated questions is whether Yazid ibn Muawiyah, the Umayyad ruler at the time, directly ordered the killing of Imam Hussein, along with his family and companions. What ought to be a matter of historical analysis and logical reasoning is often clouded by sectarian anxieties, emotional allegiances, and conflicting narratives handed down over generations. Indeed, any article that addresses this question in a traditional manner is likely to be dismissed by some as taking sides, and that, precisely, is the problem this article seeks to confront. The inability to approach such critical historical and moral questions without being imprisoned by partisanship, sentiment, or inherited bias. This article is not about choosing sides. It is about applying consistent principles of logic and political theory to a defining moment in Islamic history. Argument. There is already a substantial body of literature authored by highly respected and well-established scholars on the tragedy of Karbala. Given the depth and breadth of that existing scholarship, there is little value in merely reiterating what has already been articulated, often with greater authority and expertise, by those far more qualified to speak on the matter. What appears to be missing, however, is a categorically clear analysis of who bears responsibility for the events that transpired. Remarkably, Despite the historical weight of the tragedy and the passage of over 13 centuries, there remains disagreement over whether Yazid ibn Muawiyah can be held accountable for it. The argument commonly presented in defense of Yazid is that, being located in Damascus thousands of miles away from the battlefield of Karbala, he cannot be directly blamed. He was not physically present to lead the Umayyad army, nor was he on the ground issuing commands to his appointed officials, such as Ubayd Allah ibn Ziyad, the governor of Kufa, and Umar ibn Sa'ad, the commander of the Umayyad forces. A further line of reasoning contends that there is no definitive documentary evidence of an explicit order from Yazid instructing the killing of Imam Hussein, his family members and companions. In the absence of such a directive, his defenders argue, one cannot claim with certainty that he sanctioned what occurred. Yet, this is precisely where the need arises for a rigorous analysis grounded in logic and political theory, an analysis which this article now proceeds to explore. How can logic help us? In matters of historical accountability, especially when the consequences are as grave as the tragedy of Karbala, logic becomes an indispensable tool. It guards against emotional distortion, selective memory, and the habit of accepting or rejecting narratives based purely on sectarian alignment. First and foremost, the absence of written evidence does not automatically equate to the absence of culpability. Just because a direct order from Yazid to kill Imam Hussein has not survived in documented form does not, by any rational standard, prove that such an order was never given. Leadership, especially in an imperial context, carries with it not only the burden of decision-making, but the accountability for the consequences of delegated power. Yazid was not a marginal figure removed from events. He was the sovereign ruler of the Umayyad Empire. If he had intended to spare Hazrat Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his companions, he could have issued clear, binding instructions to that effect. He could have directed that Hazrat Imam Hussein alayhi salam be apprehended but not harmed. Yet the unfolding of events suggests otherwise. The tragedy of Karbala did not occur spontaneously, or by accident. It was a calculated sequence of decisions, beginning with Yazid's demand that Hazrat Imam Hussein alayhi salam pledge allegiance to him, and culminating in violence when that demand was refused. It was Yazid who removed the lenient governor of Kufa, Nu'man ibn Bashir, and replaced him with Ubayd Allah ibn Ziyad, a man notorious for his ruthlessness. It was Yazid who authorized the use of force to suppress dissent, and it was Yazid who, as the ruler, held ultimate control over the actions of his provincial commanders.
Let us examine, point by point, this logical chain of responsibility.
Centralization of power under Yazid. Yazid held absolute authority over the Umayyad Empire. All major political and military decisions, especially those concerning high-profile individuals like Hazrat Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the grandson of the Prophet peace be upon him, required his approval. It is implausible to suggest that an event as politically and religiously explosive as the killing of Hazrat Imam Hussein alayhi salam could have occurred without Yazid's knowledge or consent. Logic would question that if Yazid did not order the killing, then why did he not punish those who carried it out? Yazid appointed Ibn Ziyad with specific instructions. Yazid deliberately replaced the more measured governor of Kufa with a known hardliner, Ubayd Allah ibn Ziyad, and instructed him to crush dissent. Historical accounts confirm that Ibn Ziyad was given broad discretionary powers, with an expectation of complete submission from the people of Kufa, ATA, even at the cost of bloodshed. Logical inference here would dictate that when ruler installs a ruthless subordinate and grants him broad authority to eliminate opposition, he also bears direct responsibility for the outcome.
Yazid's silence after the massacre.
After the events of Karbala, Yazid did not rebuke, let alone dismiss or punish, those who carried out the massacre. On the contrary, he rewarded Ibn Ziyad by letting him retain his governorship. From a logical standpoint, in an absolutist regime, silence in the face of atrocity is not neutrality. It is very clearly an endorsement. The parade of captives to Yazid's court. The severed heads of the martyrs, including that of Imam Hussein, were presented to Yazid in Damascus, alongside the surviving women and children of the Prophet's Tsar household. Numerous sources recount Yazid publicly humiliating the captives, and some report that he struck Hussein's head with a stick while mocking the lineage of the Prophet. Such a reception reflects not remorse, but either premeditated approval or, at the very least, satisfaction with the outcome. While emotional narratives have long dominated discussions of Karbala, it is logic rooted in political structure, strategic interest, and historical precedent that most forcefully affirms Yazid's responsibility. One does not require a signed command to trace a ruler's hand in an atrocity when the evidence of intent, benefit, and silence is overwhelming. Beyond the tools of logical reasoning, political theory also provides a rich and rigorous lens through which to examine the exercise of power, the structure of authority, and the nature of responsibility. The tragedy of Karbala, though often explored through religious frameworks, was also a political rupture, one that calls for serious reflection through the prisms of classical and contemporary political thought. To determine Yazid's responsibility, we must ask, what do foundational political theorists tell us about sovereign accountability in such moments? Max Weber's celebrated typology of authority, traditional, legal, rational, and charismatic, offers a compelling starting point. Yazid's rulership was based on traditional authority, inherited through dynastic succession from his father, Muawiyah. Under such a system, authority is centralized and reinforced by lineage, but it also presumes absolute control over appointed officials and the legitimacy to act in their name. When governors or military commanders act under such a sovereign structure, it is the ruler who ultimately bears responsibility for their conduct. In Yazid's case, it is not tenable to argue that those who carried out the atrocities at Karbala did so outside the scope of his authority. They acted under a system built upon his mandate and maintained by his power. The theory of Hobbesian sovereignty further sharpens this responsibility. In Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes presents the sovereign as the sole arbiter of law, authority, and coercion, whose chief duty is to preserve order even through repression if necessary. Hobbes does not excuse tyranny, but he makes clear that the sovereign cannot delegate responsibility for state actions. In this light, Yazid's insistence on total allegiance and his suppression of dissent, particularly when embodied in the figure of Imam Hussein, are not just tactical choices, but exercises of sovereign will. And as Hobbes would insist, the consequences of that will are the burden of the sovereign alone. Principal-agent theory. Principal-agent theory offers another pertinent framework. Developed in both political science and economics, it explains the dynamic between a principal, the leader, and his agents, subordinates, acting on his behalf. When those agents operate within their delegated roles and produce outcomes that the principal neither repudiates nor punishes, responsibility remains with the principal. Yazid's appointment of Ibn Ziyad and Ibn Sa'd, his failure to prevent their brutality, and his silence after Karbala all fit this model. He did not merely tolerate their actions, he benefited from them. Therefore, by the structural standards of principal-agent theory, Yazid's accountability is both formal and inescapable. Machiavellian realism adds yet another layer of interpretation, albeit a harsh one. In The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli famously argues that rulers may and at times must employ cruelty to secure political survival. From this perspective, Yazid's fixation on viewing Imam Hussein, a symbolic and charismatic rival with unrivaled moral authority, as an arch-nemesis, may be conceived as a Machiavellian strategy to preserve the integrity of his rule. Regardless of whether or not this thought should be prescribed, This interpretation does not absolve Yazid of his actions. It confirms that the killing was deliberate, calculated, and strategically motivated. Yazid's act, seen through Machiavellian eyes, was not a mistake or a bureaucratic failure. It was a conscious political decision, and that very calculation deepens, rather than diminishes, his responsibility. Contemporary political ethics, particularly the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, R2P, reinforces this further. Though modern in formulation, R2P rests on the timeless just war premise that leaders are morally and politically accountable for crimes committed under their authority, even if they do not personally execute them. Rooted in the legal framework of command responsibility, this principle has been upheld in international criminal courts, where heads of state have been found guilty of failing to prevent or punish atrocities committed by their agents. Yazid, as the head of state, had the capacity to prevent the massacre or hold its architects to account. He did neither. His complicity lies not only in what he authorized, but in what he permitted through silence and inaction. Carl Schmitt's theory of sovereignty also sharpens the point to its clearest edge. According to Schmitt, the essence of sovereignty is found in the power to declare the exception, to determine when laws can be suspended, and who is to be excluded, punished, or destroyed in the interest of preserving the political order. The decision to kill Imam Hussein, a man whose authority directly challenged Yazid's legitimacy, was precisely such an exception. It was not an accident of war or the chaos of provincial administration. It was the sovereign act of eliminating a perceived existential threat. In Schmittian terms, it was Yazid's act, not in name alone, but in essence. Taken together, these diverse yet intersecting traditions, from Weber and Hobbes to Machiavelli, modern international law, and Schmitt converge on a single conclusion. In any system where power is centralized and decisions are carried out by agents acting with the sovereign's knowledge and in the sovereign's interest, the responsibility for those decisions rests with the sovereign himself. Yazid, by every measure of political thought, ancient, early modern, and contemporary, bears responsibility for what transpired at Karbala. The first is the argument from textual silence, the absence of any surviving document or statement in which Yazid explicitly orders the killing of Imam Hussein. From the standpoint of legal positivism or proceduralism in international law, intent without a recorded command can be difficult to prove. However, political theories discussed before, such as principal-agent logic and command responsibility, maintain that culpability does not require a smoking gun, tacit approval, patterns of authority, and the failure to prevent foreseeable outcomes are often sufficient. In contemporary war crimes tribunals, leaders have been convicted not on the basis of written orders, but on their control over the actors and their inaction in the face of atrocity. A second critique suggests that responsibility lies not with Yazid, but with his subordinates Ubayd Allah ibn Ziyad and Umar ibn Sa'd, who may have exceeded their mandate, and that they may have interpreted policies according to local pressures and constraints. Yet this line of argument is weakened by the context of Yazid's highly centralized governance. In an empire where dissent from the sovereign's will was not tolerated, and in a case as sensitive as Imam Hussein's rejection to pledging allegiance, it is difficult to believe that such a decision could have occurred without the ruler's approval. Yazid's decision to not reprimand his subordinates after the massacre further erodes the credibility of this defense. A third argument appeals to post-massacre regret. Some sources record Yazid expressing sorrow or blaming Ibn Ziyad, suggesting he may have been misled. While this may align with a constructivist view of political psychology, where leaders evolve under reputational pressure, it remains unconvincing. Regret expressed only after the political action has been conducted, and without punitive or corrective action, carries no exculpatory weight. Even the regret needs to be manifestoed in some form, like punitive action against culprits. Similarly, respect and compensation to victims was absent. A fourth critique contends that Yazid's actions, however unfortunate, were necessary. From the perspective of Machiavellian realism, the argument comes that in times of political instability, the suppression of Imam Hussein's movement was a rational act to preserve order. As much as unfathomable this reasoning may feel, and that is a different debate, even taking this reasoning at its word, this argument still concedes rather than refutes culpability. To say that the violence was necessary is to admit that it was calculated and intentional. Far from exonerating Yazid, it confirms that he made a deliberate political decision with full awareness of its moral consequences. The fifth objection invokes normative relativism, cautioning against applying modern political and legal standards such as command responsibility and R2P to a 7th century context. While historical relativism is an important methodological concern, it cannot erase the transhistorical principle that responsibility follows authority. Even early Islamic sources and traditions condemned unjust rule and upheld the moral accountability of caliphs. The murder of the Prophet's sole grandson was not a marginal or contested act. It was recognized as a grave moral failing even in its own time. Lastly, some argue that the events of Karbala were too chaotic to assign clear responsibility. They cite the fragmented tribal politics of the time, poor communication, and decentralized governance. However, while unpredictability may cloud the moment, it does not eliminate the established chain of command. Yazid appointed Ibn Ziyad, who in turn dispatched Umar ibn Sa'd. Yazid's reception of the heads of the martyrs and the captives in Damascus, followed by his silence or satisfaction, confirms that control was not lost but maintained. In fact, in moments of chaos, the obligation to exercise ethical leadership becomes all the more pressing, and Yazid demonstrably failed to do so. Taken together, these critiques offer important qualifications, but none succeed in overturning the central argument. Most do not deny Yazid's involvement. They either seek to deflect it, justify it, or relativize it. Yet, from the standpoint of political authority, historical precedent, and ethical responsibility, the case for Yazid's complicity remains firm. When judged not merely by emotion, but by the standards of political thought and moral reasoning, the shadow of Karbala falls unmistakably at his feet. Conclusion: the tragedy of Karbala is not merely a tale of grief and martyrdom. It is a case study in political power, moral failure, and sovereign responsibility. While historical narratives may differ, and emotional attachments may cloud judgment, logic, and political theory offer a firm foundation upon which to assess culpability. Yazid ibn Muawiyah, as the ruler of a centralized and hierarchical empire, held the authority to prevent the killing of Imam Hussein, his family, and his companions. His refusal to do so, coupled with his deliberate appointments, his silence in the aftermath, and his evident benefit from the outcome, makes him not a distant bystander, but a responsible architect of the tragedy. From classical frameworks like Weberian authority and Hobbesian sovereignty, to modern doctrines such as principal-agent theory and command responsibility, the conclusion remains consistent. The burden of Karbala rests upon Yazid. To deny that is not to preserve historical neutrality, it is to abandon the very standards by which power and justice must be measured.
In the silence of the desert, time has swallowed empires. The banners that once waved with arrogance now lie beneath the dust. Yet the story of Karbala remains untouched, carved not in stone, but in conscience. For when truth was surrounded by power, it was not the sword that endured, it was the stand. The echo of Hussein's call still ripples across the centuries, a call that no tyranny could drown. The drops of blood that fell in the sands of Karbala became waves that reached every age, every heart that dares to ask, what is justice, and who bears its cost? When the swords of Yazid's armies dimmed, another light began to burn, the light of conscience. In the midst of ruin, it whispered that might is never right, and silence before oppression is itself a crime. That flame, lit by the sacrifice of Hussein, still glows within the dark corners of power. As the sun rises over the ruins of Damascus, it reminds the world that the voice of truth cannot be silenced by a throne. Empires rise and crumble, but every dawn still recites the same verse. In every age, Karbala returns. In every age, the test of conscience begins anew.